Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert.
Culture is super fundamental. Culture is perhaps the most important element in protecting an organization, and it starts at the top.
That was Taddeo, former FBI agent and current CISO. In this episode of the ISF podcast, we bring you the last of 3 conversations with Leo and ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin. In this episode, Leo discusses thinking like the adversary, how the board and CISO can work together to respond to cybersecurity threats, and more.
So how do you balance that sort of requirement, I suppose, to understand risk, take a certain degree of risk, right? Because that's what running a business is all about. How do you balance that up with the traditional approach that CISOs always had, which is, highly responsible, trying to protect the company's best assets? Because from time to time, the two could be in conflict. And so there is this balance that people have to strike. Any sort of advice for CISOs on how they might go about doing that? You've already mentioned that they need to be much closely engaged with the business leaders. But any other sort of advice that you can offer up in that to help them?
I think it's very hard for CISOs to accurately understand what the most important assets of an organization really are. So one of the exercises in a risk management process is understanding what is important to the company and understanding how those assets may be vulnerable. And in the cyber field, we talk about cyber vulnerabilities. But I am constantly impressed by our adversaries' ability to spot what's valuable ahead of us. Mm-hmm. They know ways of monetizing our data that we don't. They have innovation in how to create pain points for us that we don't. So I'll take, for example, Sony Pictures Entertainment in 2014. If you were a super effective CISO for Sony Pictures Entertainment, your advice to the company would be, Crown Jewel, for example, would be an undistributed motion picture. It's intellectual property. We've invested millions of dollars in it. If someone else can put it on a site where it can be downloaded anonymously and for free, we lose all of that money. So let's logically protect undistributed films in digital form.
Right.
Wherever they are located, let's wrap layered defenses around them. And you probably spend a lot of money, and rightly so. But that's not what hurt the company. What hurt the company was the exposure of executive emails that were embarrassing to the company. And if you lose a movie, you have a quantifiable loss. You need to make that up. You need to make another movie in order to make up the loss. If you lose your reputation, or if you lose your relationship with the artists that make those movies, then you may be out of business. And so the adversary in that case was extraordinarily effective in understanding what really could hurt the enterprise. And I think that's a hard thing for CISOs to do, is to think like the adversary and examine what it is they really need to protect, because the simple answer, what you'll get from a consultant or a vendor, is what everybody else is doing. Mm-hmm. But if your enterprise, like many of ours, is unique, that may not be the right answer. And very rarely can a CISO argue effectively that what is the obvious most important asset isn't so important, and let's protect something else in the company. And I want to spend money on protecting something else. And that becomes risky. And, the CISO function hasn't been known to be risk takers. This is a function that is all about minimizing risk. So I think that's a continuing challenge, is understanding what can hurt the company in the way the adversary thinks about it.
Mm. I mean, it's a very interesting point you make, thinking like the adversary. I think a lot of people listening to this would be sitting there nodding, and then they'd say, well, how do I do that? I mean, any advice for them on how they can go about doing that? Is there, there's scenarios they can play out? Tell us a bit more about that.
Right. CISO teams need to be consumers, active consumers of all things cyber. It is sometimes distracting. The day-to-day work of an IT security team is hard enough, but taking time during the day to understand how an adversary thinks may not be at the top of their list. So in my view, the most efficient way is to engage your colleagues. There's a great community out there of cyber security professionals, and sharing experiences and sharing best practices goes a long way. But there's also a lot of open source material. There's government material. And If you don't have the ability to do it as an individual, you need to create that capability. Either you can purchase it from a threat vendor, or you can, if you have the funds and your enterprise is large enough to support it, create a threat team within your organization, somebody to think like the adversary for you. Not just a simple pen test, but an enterprise-wide view of really who might be out there looking at your infrastructure to see how it's vulnerable. And we see examples of that every day. Microsoft just took down, I think it was last month, 6 domains that were in names similar to domains that were what are described as conservative think tank organizations. And this indicates the first phase of a campaign against those organizations. So if you're the CISO, and maybe these organizations don't even have a CISO, you kind of got a clue that if you're political in this day and age, you're a potential target. But the Microsoft takedown would be something extraordinarily interesting to you because you might be in the category of interest for a foreign intelligence service. So many times you don't have to go beyond the front page to find out whether or not you are in the crosshairs.
Mm-hmm. And you've made the point that, CISOs need to work much better with business leaders. And I spend a lot of my time, so I'm sure you do, working with the boards of companies around the world. And one of the questions I get asked quite regularly is, what are the questions that I should be asking as a board member of my CISO to try to assess the cyber resilience of my organization? Any advice there?
Building that technical capability on the board level is hard and sometimes, I won't say counterproductive, but I've seen it done properly and improperly. To me, the largest contribution that a board can make and that a CEO can make to the company is creating an atmosphere where it's okay to tell the truth.
Mm-hmm.
That is easy to say, but hard to do because many times boards and CEOs and C-suites don't want to hear the truth. And that is CISOs and other professionals in the company are highly sensitized to what their leaders want to hear. And if they only want to hear good news, then that's what you're going to get. So I think creating the culture where we can look at ourselves honestly and share risk and understand risk across the enterprise. I'll give you an example. With Equifax, the most recent breach that they've publicly acknowledged, you could see that they invested in cybersecurity, but when their CEO testified, you can see that cybersecurity didn't have the authority within the company to enforce security.
Right.
And I'm sure that was not a new quality or concept within the company. I'm sure that was something that was obvious to a lot of people in the company. Why that never got to the board or CEO, or if it did get to the CEO, why it was never acted upon. I think, the CEO lost his job because of it. The stock plummeted because of it. I don't know if it's recovered yet, and their quarterly revenue hasn't recovered. So the impact is significant and something a board should have been paying attention to. But I think you can trace a lot of significant public cyber incidents back to a security culture where security professionals knew what was going on. Even other C-suite executives knew what was going on, but nobody could make the hard decisions or at least acknowledge the risk because there wasn't the culture of being safe and announcing it.
So culture is really fundamental, is what you're saying.
Culture is super fundamental. Culture is perhaps the most important element in protecting an organization, and it starts at the top. If there's a set of rules for the line employees, but senior executives don't have to take these security precautions, then that percolates down, and individuals within the company get a sense of how important security is based on what they observe. It's no different than any other core concept within an organization. Customer service is something that's driven from the top. Ethics are driven from the top. And security is driven from the top. It's a fundamental component of leadership. Many professionals in the IT security environment operate in enterprises where there's a disconnect, where there's a written security policy that seems very robust, and yet in practice it's not enforced. And so that sometimes creates a tension between what is really expected and what we are saying is expected. And CISOs have to navigate that. It's a reality. But if the question is, what can boards do? What can CEOs do? Their primary function is to make it safe for CISOs to tell them the truth.
Fantastic. Leo, thank you very much indeed for sharing some of those insights, particularly based on some of the experience you've had with the FBI, but then bringing it right up to date today. And particularly, I think those comments around what it is that boards and CEOs can do are very, very valuable. So thank you very much indeed.
Yes.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to our 3-part series with Leo Taddeo. If you missed episodes 1 and 2, be sure to visit the ISF media page to catch up. And come back soon for another valuable conversation with Steve and an expert guest. In the meantime, for more resources for CISOs and anyone looking to enhance the security of their business, please visit securityforum.org. And we'd like to hear from you. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover or someone you'd like us to interview, get in touch through our website or tweet us at Security Forum. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next time.